Hello, Doomers and Doomettes, I'm your host Dee, and I'll say it again, it's no secret that I'm a huge fan of Transformers. We're approaching the 40th anniversary of the franchise, and with another movie on the horizon, one that I'll certainly have opinions on when it comes out, I thought now would be as good a time as any to take a look at another corner of the Transformers multiverse. And since I spent the prior Transformer videos discussing series that I think were well deserved of praise and affection, I think it's time to take a more critical look at another continuity. A series which really should have been a new golden standard in the franchise, but ultimately through a variety of reasons from corporate meddling, toy mandates, to poor writing decisions, ultimately fell flat. Instead of rebooting the entire franchise into a streamlined new, singular continuity, what we got was a cluttered mess that led to cancellations, heartbreaks, and tragic ends. I'm talking, of course, about the wasted potential of Transformers Prime.
Team Prime knows when to use force and how much to use.
Oh, kid, I needed that!
Now, Transformers Prime may not be a terrible series, there's much worse Transformer shows out there, and it certainly has plenty of fans and people who adore the series, but it's also one that's heavily debated on forums and message boards, where the mere mention of certain scenes and character moments can spur pages of intense discussion. So the objective here today isn't to just say Transformers Prime is the worst series in the franchise, but rather take a more critical lens to it, to identify if it is really deserving of its praise and shed light on its troubled background and its effect on other areas of the brand. If you like Transformers Prime, great, more power to you. I'm not going to say you're wrong for liking it, everyone's entitled to what they want. But if you do choose to continue with the video, I encourage you to have an open mind as we explore the history of the show and perhaps examine a world of what could have been. If you're not interested in that, well, feel free to leave a comment complaining about it. And just before we begin, I'd like to announce some big news. I've recently helped in creating and partnering with a new online toy shop, TransWarp Toys, which specializes in action figure collecting, including a heavy emphasis on Transformers. If you're an action figure collector yourself and you want to support the channel, you can use the promo code DOOMERDEN for 5% off your first order on TransWarp Toys. If you have the chance and want to support a small toy retail business, please check it out. And as always, before we begin, I'd just like to humbly ask that if this is content you're interested in, please consider liking the video or subscribing if you'd like to see more. And if you're a returning subscriber, thanks for coming back. With that said, get that ground bridge started up because it's time to talk about Transformers Prime.
Lord Megatron, I have found something of great interest. An Autobot.
In order to understand how Transformers Prime came to be, it's important to go back to the roots, and that brings us to the year 2009, when Hasbro announced that it would be partaking in a joint effort with Discovery to rebrand Discovery Kids into a new channel, The Hub. Hasbro would have had the opportunity to acquire and produce new programming for the channel, and the intention was to fill it up with various Hasbro brands. This of course ranged from franchises like G.I. Joe, game shows based on their board games, Littlest Pet Shop, and some show about magic horses that I'm sure no one on the internet remembers.
I may have gone too far in a few places.
Of course, being one of Hasbro's flagship IPs, Transformers was set to get a new show as well. This meant, unfortunately, that the current ongoing series, Transformers Animated, which was airing on Cartoon Network, had to be cancelled to start to make way for a new project. Now, there were other reasons for that cancellation, though I'd recommend checking out my Transformers Animated video for more information on that. At the moment, Transformers as a brand was doing really well. Despite the critical backlash, the second live-action film, Revenge of the Fallen, made nearly $1 billion at the box office, and a fancy new video game was in development in the form of High Moon Studios' War for Cybertron game, one of the few major attempts to develop a Transformers video game without it being tied into any other media such as the live-action films. Because of this, Hasbro brought in the screenwriters Alex Kurtzman and Roberto Orsi to helm the development of the show. If those names sound familiar, you may remember them from such blockbuster and beloved films like The Mummy reboot, Amazing Spider-Man 2, Star Trek Into Darkness, and Cowboys vs. Aliens.
Oh no.
Kurtzman and Orsi were joined by Jeff Klein and Dwayne Capazzi as the showrunners, to which Hasbro then handed the four of them the Binder of Revelation, a production bible made by Hasbro with over 300 pages that cost over $250,000 to produce. Hasbro employees such as Aaron Archer, Rick Alvarez, and more put in a ton of time, effort, and creative vision to create what would essentially be fresh groundwork for the brand going forward. The Binder of Revelation detailed the history of Cybertron and its lore, gave intensive character profiles on what was true to their vision. Now, perhaps you may be wondering, what was the reason for such an extensive project? Why go through that effort? Well, Hasbro has decided that Transformers as a whole was perhaps getting a bit too cluttered as a brand, with several series that had spanned since 1984, some holding on to the original G1 continuity while others branching out into different timelines. Things may appear to be a bit complicated to the general viewer. Characters could share a name, yet have completely different identities in series to series, and it may not be clear to which show belonged to which continuity. So Hasbro decided to step in and create a sort of alignment, if you will. Take the best elements of the decades of content and attempting to streamline it into a new universe, creating what could have been seen as the ideal version of the setting, the lore, and the characters. Thus, this new continuity earned the nickname of the Aligned Continuity. The basis for this new continuity kicked off with the 2010 game War for Cybertron, a new story detailing the original war on the planet of Cybertron, detailing Megatron's rise to power and how Optimus Prime stood against him for the first time. On a side note, the game was phenomenally fun as a release and certainly deserves its own video in regards to the history and unfortunate downfall of the series. However, unfortunately, to tie it in with this video, I'd have to keep its mention brief. Released alongside the video game was a novel, Transformers Exodus, offering a more in-depth look as to how life on Cybertron was and how the war erupted. Both War for Cybertron and Exodus took their elements from the Binder of Revelation, existing as the first story set in this new continuity. While they were not exactly perfect, as both the game and the novel had some elements that contradicted each other, they were clearly telling a similar type of story with mostly the same characters. So the intention was to continue this continuity with a new television series to tie into this streamlined story universe. Plans for the new universe were so ambitious that Hasbro even asked IDW Publishing to drop their current lines and instead reboot the Transformers into this new continuity of stories. IDW ultimately turned down this idea, but it really shows how ambitious Hasbro was with this project. Which unfortunately brings us back to the writers Kurtzman and Orsi, who upon receiving the Binder of Revelation promptly decided that they didn't really need nor want it, and instead opted to do their own thing. The reason why? They simply didn't want to be held on to older material in the franchise, and having primarily worked on the live-action films, that's ultimately where they decided to take their inspiration. Essentially, after being given the groundwork for their new series with a creative vision in mind already, set by the owners of the IP, Kurtzman and Orsi basically said, nah, we'll be fine. So with the groundwork set and promptly tossed aside, the Binder of Revelation promptly found a new home in the bottom of a drawer somewhere in Pawtucket, Rhode Island. And with this, production of Transformers Prime began. Hasbro Studios produced the series, with Polygon Pictures working as the company behind the animation. If that name sounds familiar, they were one of the production companies behind the Godzilla anime trilogy of films.
Bruh. Look at this dude.
Okay, I have to admit, that was a cheap shot. The animation in Transformers Prime is fine for what it is. Music in the series was composed by Brian Tyler, who has done a lot of big-budget composing as well, such as in several Marvel films like Iron Man 3 and Avengers Age of Ultron, as well as in Scream 5, and most recently in the new Super Mario Bros. Movie by Illumination. To talk a bit more positively about Transformers Prime, this honestly gives the series a very cinematic and grand soundtrack, which really stands apart from the music in other series. It helps give Transformers Prime this more sophisticated feel, as if it really is a big budget film on the small screen, and I think that's one thing to give it credit for. Another really positive element to give the series was the voice acting. Peter Cullen returned once more as Optimus Prime, following up on his return to the brand after the live-action films and the War for Cybertron game. Transformers Prime is also the first series to see the return of Frank Welker as Megatron on the television screen again, a big deal for many fans. Also joining the cast were several other prominent voice actors like Steve Bloom as Starscream, Jeffrey Combs as Ratchet, Kevin Michael Richardson as Bulkhead, and Darren Norris as Knockout, to name a few. So with that framework in mind to set the series, what exactly was the show about? When Transformers Prime was first revealed as a concept, it was stated to be titled as such because the series was intended to be about what it meant to be a Prime.
The lie detector determined that was a lie.
Set on modern-day Earth, Transformers Prime starts off with the core cast of Autobots in hiding on Earth, protecting it from the Decepticons who are raiding Earth due to the loss of their homeworld Cybertron, and are in dire need of resources. For some reason, Earth is rich in energon, the primary fuel source of the Transformers, and so the Autobots must protect the planet from being ravaged by the Decepticons. It's a pretty standard setup for a Transformers story, but I'd say the first issue with the series, albeit a minor one, is that there's not really an introduction into the why or how the Transformers got there. Things already start off established as if the full main cast has been there for who knows how long, with the only introduction being from the human's perspective. This differs a bit from most Transformers shows, who will usually show the initial landing on Earth and set them up there, whether it be a crash landing or showing them in pursuit of something else on the planet. Instead, things are already pretty in motion, and in the first episode, Optimus warns that Megatron may someday return, and within a few seconds, he does.
Megatron has not been seen nor heard from in some time. But if his return is imminent, as I fear, it could be catastrophic.
A few moments later.
I have returned.
There's not a lot of character built up, and what would be the point of saying a character has gone missing for years, only to immediately have them show up for the first time mere moments later? A minor nitpick, I'm sure, but I'd say things really stack up once the episode plots come about. The first season is very much introductory, introducing several new characters and even an additional faction or so. We get the new Autobots, who occasionally join the plot, and an evil human faction named Mech, who we'll get into a bit later in the video. Aside from this, episodes may be about searching for Energon to solve their energy crisis, or uncovering some sort of Cybertronian artifact that just so happens to be on Earth. Better remember that last part, because we'll really be talking about it in just a sec. The climax of Season 1 revolves around the biggest bad of all in Transformers, Unicron. Unicron is revealed to be the core of Earth itself, producing dark energon throughout the planet. It leads to the Autobots and Decepticons needing to team up to put the Chaos Bringer back to his slumber. If Season 1 consisted of mostly introductory content, then I'd say Season 2 is where the flaws in the storytelling become more evident. This season, things become more, well, MacGuffin focused. It's a big problem the brand has faced before, particularly in the live-action films, where the characters do little more than chase down powerful alien artifacts, and unfortunately, that's the majority of the season's story arc. It begins with the Autobots and Decepticons scrambling to find various ancient artifacts left on Earth, before transitioning to the latter half to focus on how recovering ancient relics known as the Cyber Keys are capable of restoring their homeworld. That's not to say that every single episode in Season 2 focus on these scavenger hunts, but a significant portion of the season does. And it's here where I'd like to pause and talk about why I think this was really problematic for the show. It causes the plot to just get repetitive and seemingly unfocused. First off, I'd say that simply having a powerful artifact as a focal point in the series isn't necessarily a bad thing. Both Beast Wars and Animated were Transformers series that handled powerful relics in manners which contributed to the overall plot as a whole, while also not letting the majority of episodes be about finding pieces of things. In the example of Transformers Animated, a significant portion of episode revolve around finding fragments of the Allspark, but it's not just a race to get it. Characters may stumble on these pieces, which drive the plot in different directions, whether it creates life or a villain gets a hold of it to create a weapon. In some cases, it may not be evident that one is at play until closer to the end of the episode. All of this is while driving the narrative of the series, of the aftermath of what happened to the Allspark and the fallout of the prior fight with Megatron. Compare this to the scavenger hunts of Season 2 in Transformers Prime. Most episodes will begin with someone receiving a signature for a particular relic and racing to get it. The item may be of some use in the episode or in a following one, but ultimately some other relic is found and the process begins again. In one particularly bad example, there's an episode that revolves around the discovery of the Star Saber, an ancient powerful Cybertronian sword with the ability to slice mountains in half, only for it to be shattered to pieces in the very next episode by a newly made sword. Yes, they are able to fix it episodes later, but it still goes to show the level of inconsistent stakes in the series, something I'll touch upon a bit later. Season 3 is the final season of the show, and honestly doesn't do a whole lot to improve the story. As part of a toy mandate from Hasbro, the new faction of the Predacons, the equivalent of Cybertronian dinosaurs, were introduced, and the gimmick of Season 3 ultimately became about hunting down cloned Predacon fossils, continuing the scavenger hunt style plots from Season 2. This leads to the grand finale of the series, closing out with a TV movie titled Predacons Rising, where Unicron makes his return in an attempt to take control of the planet. All in all, the plot of the show isn't offensively bad, but it certainly gets a bit repetitive with the constant hunting of artifacts. However, that's just a brief overview of the general plot elements of the show. In order to break things down even further, I think it's time we transition to the next stage of the breakdown. A mediocre plot can certainly shine brighter with excellent character chemistry. In all honesty, a significant portion of the first season of Beast Wars is a bit droll. However, the character relationship and dialogues managed to pull the series into something far more engaging. So let's take a look at the cast of characters. I ask that you bear with me, as this might get a little bit more like an info dump, but I think it's all important information to cover as we discuss the series as a whole. Starting with the Autobots, we are of course led by Optimus Prime, and this might be heresy to say, but if I had to describe this version of Optimus, I'd say he's honestly kind of flat.
Optimus, you want to see something funny?
No.
Now, before I continue, this has absolutely nothing to do with Peter Cullen's performance, as he's certainly the definitive version of Prime and has delivered countless excellent performances before and after the series, but I feel as though the material given to him was a little two-dimensional for such an iconic character. This version of Prime lacks the fatherly side that may appear in G1 or the Unicron trilogy, and lacks the character growth that appears for similar characters in Beast Wars or Animated. We're sorta just told that Optimus is the wisest and strongest, and that's how things are. There's not a lot he goes through as a character or lives with the decisions of his actions. In this series, things just sort of happen and he's around to save the day. There's not a lot I feel I can describe about his character, aside from everyone else in the show already calling him wise and powerful, but honestly I feel like Optimus suffered by not really getting any real attention to himself, especially when the show is called Prime. Next up, we have everyone's favorite Autobot scout, Bumblebee, and unfortunately he doesn't have a lot to write home about either. Similar to Prime, he doesn't really have much of a character arc or development, and in his case, it may have been a result of him being heavily based on his movie counterpart. However, unlike Bumblebee in the movies, who can communicate via radio, Prime Bumblebee is only capable of communicating through simple beeps like R2-D2, that only his human companion and the other Autobots understand.
Indeed, Bumblebee.
It essentially reduces him to a bit more like a prop, with less identity to himself aside from being a fighter. Coming off the heels of Transformers Animated, where Bumblebee was a brash chatterbox with clear desires and ambitions, it certainly felt like a bit of a downgrade to lose basically all communicative capabilities like in the films.
How come you have 3 faces? Couldn't decide which was the ugliest? And who uses ice as a weapon? I mean, what are you, a refrigerator?
You want heat? I'll give you more than you can handle! Oh, flag!
Speaking of Transformers Animated, we have a major carryover from there in the form of fan favorite Bulkhead. Here, Bulkhead has been altered a bit, making him less of a gentle giant and more of a big loyal bruiser, but I'd say for the most part he's still fun to watch and definitely still has his more goofy moments. The interesting thing is that this role on the team was originally intended to be the Autobot Ironhide, however was swapped out to Bulkhead due to Ironhide's upcoming death in the live action films. The source for this comes from the DVD commentary for Season 1, where it was confessed that ultimately, with the knowledge of Ironhide's death in the live-action films, there was concerns of confusing kids with a living Ironhide. So, as a result, Bulkhead was carried over from Animated. Overall, while I'd say Bulkhead was pretty decent in the series, the real tragedy for him occurs in Season 2, where he receives a spark-threatening injury, and it's heavily spoken that he may not recover to be the same bruising bot he once was. However, despite that, he ends up fine within a few episodes' time, and the injury is never spoken of again. Another import from Animated, in a way, would be Ratchet, the Autobot medic. Honestly, he's pretty good in the series, retaining his grumpy old doctor persona with a bit of a soft side for Earth as much as he'd hate to admit it.
I transported them to the designated coordinates via the ground bridge.
What's a ground bridge?
A scaled-down version of space bridge technology. Since we don't currently possess the means or the energon required for intergalactic travel.
You're stuck here. On Earth.
With the likes of you, yes.
As far as the Autobots go, I think he's got to be my favorite character on that front, as he feels the most genuine of them, and he has some of the most significant character flaws, especially when it comes to his desire to see Cybertron restored, even if it means the expense of elements of the Earth, a world he doesn't quite feel is his home.
Megatron was using the Omega Lock to attack the Earth.
Optimus saved our planet.
What about our planet? All of our struggles and energon spilled and countless sacrifices for nothing?
It adds a level of nuance for the character relationships and deepens how the Cybertronians feel about Earth, and this is honestly one of the things I'd suspected they intended to focus a bit more in the conceptual stage of the series. RC also joins the Autobot cast, going through a bit of a meta-redemption arc after how horrible the screenwriters handled RC in the live-action films. Prime RC, I'd say, is another standout Autobot character, a hardened fighter fiercely dedicated to her comrades and has to struggle with the loss of partners in the heat of war. It's certainly a different take on RC to make her more of a fighter, but I think that's honestly a really fresh and interesting take, and allows for some of the more dramatic character moments in the series. There are a few other Autobots who join the cast with more limited appearances who are certainly worth mentioning. Wheeljack, an Autobot lone wolf who spends most of the series on his own, occasionally joining the main cast, being a close friend of Bulkhead, having served with him in the elite Autobot Special Ops unit, the Wreckers. Speaking of the Wreckers, Ultra Magnus, a commanding officer of the unit, joins the cast in Season 3. The other Autobot who joins the cast rather late, and certainly deserves a bit more focus, would be that of Smokescreen. Now, be sure you're taking a seat for this one, because this one will definitely need some explanation. Smokescreen was introduced late into Season 2 as a bit of the hotshot rookie character type, a bit overconfident and inexperienced. He gets a few significant wins in, but ultimately comes across as a bit untamed at times, much to the annoyance of his comrades.
Well, one minute I'm on security detail at Iacon. The next I wake up on the other side of the galaxy to find myself under Optimus's command. I mean, what are the chances, right? Things happen for a reason.
We get it, Smokescreen. You're special, we're lucky to have you.
What's interesting about him is that, like his name would suggest, he's actually a bit of a smokescreen from a character perspective as well, as his character traits don't align with other versions of the character Smokescreen in the past, but rather the Autobot Hot Rod. In traditional Transformers media, Hot Rod is introduced as the young, overconfident rookie who ends up going through a character transformation, maturing as an individual before being handed the mantle of leadership and becoming Rodimus Prime. And shockingly enough, this character journey seemed to be something that was very nearly applied to Smokescreen. In the events of the Season 3 premiere, when Optimus Prime is in a critical state after an overwhelming Decepticon attack, Smokescreen is the only individual who helps him, and as such, Optimus nearly passes the mantle of leadership to Smokescreen.
The time for a new leader is upon us. In my spark, I believe that leader stands before me right now.
The Matrix of Leadership, one of the most sacred artifacts in Transformers, presents itself to him, with both Optimus and the spirit of his mentor, Alpha Trion, in agreement that Smokescreen must be the one to take the Matrix and now lead the Autobots with Optimus dying. Instead, upon presentation of the Matrix, Smokescreen is determined to not give up and do what he can to restore Optimus to life, which ultimately results in a new body for Optimus. Now, this type of moment at the beginning of the season would typically signal a new direction for the character. It would show that they have grown from their hotshot ways and matured a bit, with a tease that they are destined for greatness by the end of the series. If the writers just introduced the character as Hot Rod, a character well known for this type of character arc, the writing would have been seen as predictable or even cliche by Transformer standards. However, by applying it to a different character, it's ultimately something that could be a really clever way to subvert audience expectations, while also delivering something fresh and new to the franchise. Unfortunately, that's not what happens. After the Season 3 opening story, he's nearly pushed to the sidelines and is still treated like a rookie by everyone else. He's made to do basic chore work as he grumbles about how he very nearly could have been a Prime.
Now you can look your best while stacking those empty cubes.
Yes, sir. I was nearly a Prime, but somehow I'm still a rookie.
And after this, he kinda gets tossed aside. By the end of the series, during the finale of the Predacons Rising film, it becomes clear that Bumblebee is instead the one gifted with a more of a leadership position, as the Autobots follow him for most of the film. It really is a case of completely wasted potential, as you can't help but feel sorry for Smokescreen.
And to think Optimus almost passed down the Matrix to me. Whoa, what? Yeah, I said it.
Now, it's probably worth noting that there was a degree of Hasbro meddling involved here, but that's again something we'll get into a little later in here. For now, I think we spent enough time going over the Autobot cast, so let's transition into the human characters. The main human characters on Prime consist of 3 children companions to the Autobots, Jack, Raph, and Miko, as well as US government Special Agent Fowler, who is tasked with keeping a professional eye on the Autobots on Earth. Jack is paired with RC and is sort of a standard everyman. I don't really feel like there's a lot I can say about him. It's kind of like how you would perceive Spike in the original G1 series. Raph is paired with Bumblebee and is your standard archetype for the incredibly intelligent whiz kid, who often assists in the technical support of Team Prime. However, of the children companions, I feel like it's Miko who genuinely stands out the most. A foreign exchange student, Miko is paired off with Bulkhead, and honestly, of the human pairings, she really feels the most connected in regards to her friendship with the Autobots. Admittedly, she does start out a little bit annoying in the series, usually the one getting into trouble, but as the show goes on, her camaraderie with Bulkhead deepens, and she becomes much more willing to take part in the action, not necessarily out of a desire just to be chaotic, but rather to be a force of action assisting to the cause. Another honestly welcome addition to the show would be Agent Fowler, who as mentioned was a liaison between the Autobots and the US government, serving as an official figure tasked with helping the Transformers stay hidden. He has the attitude of a grizzled veteran without being too serious. He's capable of a sly remark or two, but ultimately he wants what's best for his nation. And considering how, at the time, there weren't really characters like this in Transformers cartoons, I think it really added a bit of depth to the human relationships, something which was direly needed due to the simple fact of budgeting. The actual amount of humans who appeared on the show was very, very small. The other significant human presence would be that of the villainous group, in the form of Mech, a ruthless terrorist organization determined to rule the world. Mech was created in Transformers Prime as a human organization utilizing advanced cutting-edge technology, so naturally they took a keen interest in Transformers technology. They ultimately partook in a few fights with Transformers, both Autobot and Decepticons here and there, but ultimately they were unceremoniously wiped out. Despite building up in Season 2 as a bigger threat, attempting to develop their own Transformer, ultimately they get completely wiped out by their own leader when he gets implanted into the body of a deceased Cybertronian, before the cold open of that episode even finishes.
Thank you all for your dedication and a lifetime of service.
I now seem more suited to keep the exclusive company of Titans.
So instead of having a different recurring threat with a story arc running parallel to the main story, the threat of Mech is ultimately abruptly finished off without any real conclusion. It's another case of wasted potential in the series, and seems like the writers had ideas but were either forced to drop them by Hasbro or just didn't want to pursue them. It's a shame really, because ultimately the plots revolving around Mech in Season 2, while not perfect, break up a bit of the monotony of the scavenger hunts, focusing on the Autobots to deal with a different type of threat beyond Decepticons gaining control of yet another Cybertronian artifact. And speaking of Decepticons, let's wrap up this character section by briefly going into the main villains of the series. There's Soundwave, a traditional Decepticon character who is played a little differently as the silent but deadly type this time around, who really takes a back seat for most of the series, but when he steps in, he's usually able to turn the tides in the Decepticons' favor, though it raises the question as to why Megatron doesn't use him more often. In this series, Soundwave turns into a drone airship, and instead of speaking himself, he does this admittedly really eerie but cool trick, where instead he records others' voices and then spits their lines back out as a method of communication.
Why is Megatron stealing human technology? What is he attempting to build? Why is Megatron stealing human technology? What is he attempting to build?
Whoa. Optimus Prime the remix.
Another interesting addition to the Decepticons is Knockout, a sports car who served as the often overlooked position of the Decepticon medic. With an incredibly vain personality, Knockout stands out as one of the few Decepticons with a land-based alternate mode, much to the annoyance of other Decepticons.
Yes, right, you're one of those. Come again.
In the beginning, Knockout was originally partnered with Decepticon Breakdown, a rival to Bulkhead who transformed into a van and in fact was originally intended to be a version of fan-favorite character Lugnut from Transformers Animated. However, this was changed due to the desire to have more land-based Decepticons. Breakdown is a real tragedy of a character, not because he was written in a satisfying manner, but you see he ends up quite abused in the story, originally serving as the Decepticon muscle before getting captured and tortured by Mech, only to, shortly afterwards, be killed off once more in a rather quick manner, and his corpse is later used as a life support suit for the leader of Mech. It's really kind of harsh for the character, especially to one who didn't really get to do much in the series prior, and ultimately seemed like he actually had a chance at redemption with some of the Autobots. Of course, there's plenty of other Decepticons who cycle in the series at various points. There's Shockwave, Chief Science Officer, who shows up in Season 3 and is responsible for the Predacon Bone scavenger hunts. There's Dreadwing, a Decepticon explosive expert, and Arachnid, a rival to RC with no real allegiance who controls an army of Insecticons and kinda just gets removed from the story rather abruptly as well. If there's any Decepticon who stands out most though, it's Starscream. Here, he serves as the second in command of the Decepticon forces and spends a significant portion of the series attempting to fulfill his own ambitions. It's traditional Starscream behavior for those familiar with the character as he plots and schemes his way to attempt to take control of the Decepticons. And honestly, I think this portrayal of Starscream works rather well as an individual. I think it takes a lot of the best elements of the characters from across the franchise. He's sly but also a coward, clever but arrogant, and overall a real threat when he finally puts his mind to something. I think it's really satisfying to watch him attempt to usurp command of the Decepticons in his usual fashion, yet at the same time there are several points in the story where he actually is a severe threat to not only the Autobots, but his former Decepticon comrades as well. In Season 1, Starscream attempts to secure command of the Decepticons by keeping Megatron in a coma. Ultimately, when Megatron is resurrected, after suffering a few beatings, he ends up abandoning the Decepticons to serve his own needs, and ultimately decides that his place should not be under someone like Megatron, but rather servicing himself.
I have been a fool, made mistakes, monumental ones. But I have gained a clear understanding of my place in this universe, of who I am. Starscream. Aligned with no side, servant to no one.
What occurs throughout the rest of the first season into Season 2 sees Starscream as a foe to both sides, and ultimately through his schemes he's able to secure a strong enough foothold to actually barter his way back into the Decepticons against all odds. For Starscream fans, it's certainly an interesting arc, and viewers will certainly enjoy seeing such a fleshed out version of the iconic character. However, Starscream's character comes at a heavy cost. You may have noticed a certain Decepticon leader absent from my ramblings thus far, and that's because I think he's deserving of his own section, and not for particularly good reasons. A series can only be as good as its villain, and in the Transformers franchise, there's no character who I favor more than Megatron. Something about the mix of intellect and overwhelming strength, with the ability to strike fear into his troops, it's always really struck a chord with me. He's the kind of character who truly believes he's in the right and doing what is absolutely needed for the planet of Cybertron, no matter the cost to anything else. And when the initial details for Megatron were revealed in Transformers Prime, I was extremely excited. With Frank Welker returning to the role on television screens, a menacing design, and promises of a deeper version of the character, I was thrilled. Instead, what Prime Megatron turned out to be was a creature with a bark far worse than his bite. The Megatron of the Aligned continuity starts off extremely strong in the War for Cybertron game, a brutal warlord whose unquenchable thirst for power sees him poisoning the planet with a corrupted form of Energon, known as Dark Energon, allowing him to gain control of the planet. That is until the second episode of Prime, where Megatron claims to have found Dark Energon after years of searching for it, with no idea what it could possibly do. So he merges it with his spark, exactly like he did at the outbreak of the Cybertronian War in the video game. This feels like one small example, and perhaps you could just wave it off as the show writer's not familiar with the War for Cybertron game. But going back to what I was saying about how there was little communication on the project with the intended purpose to align the Transformers brand, it certainly can remove you from the immersion when you begin to notice these inconsistencies, and Megatron was no stranger to it. This version of Megatron also feels like he does little more than bark and yell at times. I feel this is no more evident than in his relationship with Starscream in the series. As I mentioned, I think Prime's version of Starscream is honestly pretty well developed, and exactly what I would want out of that character. There's a character arc of his movement from scheming for leadership to realizing that his time for leadership will eventually come, and he recognizes his strengths with the team as opposed to flying solo, so to say. But this character journey comes at the expense of making Megatron extremely tolerant and forgiving of Starscream's treachery, which honestly starts to feel very out of character as the show goes on. In the original Transformers cartoon from the 1980s, a common question is, how come Megatron kept Starscream around?
You disgust me.
The answer to that one is rather simple. As a 1980s series, it needed to keep its storyline simple and was not really capable of committing such intense acts of violence on characters. Megatron kept Starscream around to keep a status quo, and because as a kid's cartoon, we really couldn't do anything too violent to be rid of him. Well, that was until the 1986 film when Hasbro decided to simply kill off all the toys that were no longer around.
Will anyone else attempt to fill his shoes?
As time has gone on and the brand persisted, the question remained as new stories came out, and more fiction gave a level of realism to their dynamic, and Megatron has tolerated Starscream less and less over the years. In Transformers Animated, when the Megatron of that series is resurrected after an assassination attempt from Starscream, Megatron kills him. There's no way to sugarcoat this. Starscream was dead. He of course gets resurrected as the series continues, but Megatron never accepted Starscream back into his ranks, but rather used him as a tool if he had the opportunity. And when he realized Starscream's usefulness has ended, Megatron left him for dead.
You are no longer of use to me.
Even the Megatron of Transformers Cyberverse had a similar moment where his toleration of Starscream's treachery ended and he was mercilessly beaten. So now let's look at the actions of Prime Megatron in relation to his Starscream. In the beginning of the series, Starscream leaves Megatron for dead in space and actually removes the shard of Dark Energon, keeping him alive at the time. Megatron then is in a comatose state for the first half of the season, and of course upon his resurrection, mercilessly beats the spark out of Starscream for leaving him for dead. But Starscream is sent to the repair bay and lives to tell the tale, with a strong warning from Megatron. Shortly after this though, Starscream didn't seem to learn his lesson, as he attempted to raise his own undead warrior to serve him to scheme against Megatron. Megatron becomes aware of this, and in a later scene, finally reveals to Starscream why he's tolerated him for so long.
The fact is, Starscream, despite your treachery, I've allowed you to carry on this long because I took a certain delight in following your string of failures. But you finally become tiresome, predictable. You've hit rock bottom.
In this moment, Megatron was prepared to execute the traitor. He clearly had enough of his transgressions, enough of his scheming, and was prepared to put an end to Starscream. Starscream, however, is saved from execution when the Autobot RC shows up, triggering a fight which leads to a cave-in. The episode ends with Megatron contemplating if he should rescue Starscream from the cave-in or just leave him for dead. And well, considering his appearance in the next episode, it's safe to assume that Megatron rescued Starscream. So, despite Megatron taking Starscream to a site to be executed and seeing Starscream abandoned abandoned him. He saves him? For me, it's this very moment where the immersion is lost. Megatron has made it clear that he no longer tolerates Starscream for his shenanigans, but yet by the episode end, things return to the status quo. And for what? The writers get to keep Starscream alive, but the reasoning for doing so is done at the expense of Megatron's own characterization. And it only gets worse from there. Eventually, Starscream leaves the Decepticons to go on his own as a solo operative, and he causes numerous problems for the Decepticons, attempting to have Megatron killed multiple times. And yet, when Starscream realizes he needs the Decepticons again and transports to the main warship with a peace offering, Starscream is welcomed back with nearly open arms, and Megatron even kills a previously loyal Decepticon who is angered by the dishonorable Starscream being welcomed back into the ranks. At a character level, this genuinely makes no sense at all. This Megatron ends up being the most forgiving of Starscream and his treachery, or even anyone's treachery, because the writers needed a way to keep certain characters around, and the result of it is a Megatron who comes off as very soft and honestly not threatening, and in a way just as cartoony as his original 1980s counterpart who couldn't take any serious action because it was a kid's show. Another problem with this particular version of Megatron is he feels aimless in a way. Now, it's true that he had his goal of resurrecting his homeworld of Cybertron and being leader of the planet, but that's pretty standard stuff. Despite that, there's not really an overarching goal, no tease of a greater plan. His plan is usually just find artifacts that happen to be on Earth and use them to win. Compare this to how the Megatron of Transformers Animated acts, who spends an entire season constructing a space bridge to allow him to teleport to Cybertron, or the Megatron of Beast Wars, who has the realization over the course of Season 2 that he is capable of altering Earth's history. For Prime Megatron, lacking this makes it feel like there's not really much of a build-up to a grand event happening, but instead you're just watching a collection of tools and toys, with some more powerful than others. First, he wants an army of zombie Transformers, then he starts collecting some relics, and then he plans to serve Unicron, but once he's rejected by Unicron, he decides he now wants to fight him. More scavenger hunts, more plans to make an army, it's all over the place. So it really makes his plans feel like there's not a lot of direction to them, outside of vague power grabs and wanting to amass an army. And considering this was supposed to be one of the more developed and nuanced takes of the character, I think it instead depicts him as rather two-dimensional. And don't get me started on his half-assed redemption in the finale of the series. In the Predacons Rising film, Megatron ends up possessed by Unicron, his body used as a puppet for the Dark God while Unicron tortures his mind. And in the end, when freed from Unicron's control, Megatron realizes that inflicting pain is bad?
Because I now know the true meaning of oppression, and have thus lost my taste for inflicting it.
So you're telling me that the character who started a war because he was enraged at the Cybertronian government, slaughtered countless in combat, mercilessly beats his underlings, and tried to murder human civilians, suddenly realized that hurting others is a bad thing?
Wonder what this feels like. Ow! That hurts! My God, is that what I've been doing to people? I belong here.
What it all comes down to is when you have a character who is intended to be your main villain, but lacks that sort of narrative direction and constantly makes verbal threats that he never follows up on, it ends up lowering the overall stakes of the series. It feels like there's less a reason to be invested, and if your main villain never really feels like he makes a dent in the series, especially compared to other incarnations of the character, what do you have in your series? And well, I think that's the real problem with Transformers Prime as a whole. Transformers Prime as a whole feels empty. The world feels barren, the danger doesn't seem too large, and things that should develop, both character-wise and setting-wise, really don't. I feel like a pretty big example of this is the inclusion of the Viacons, grunt Decepticons that serve as the basic foot soldiers for the Autobots to beat up. Interestingly enough, this concept actually isn't really used a lot in Transformers outside of video games, and the only other major instance of foot soldiers in Transformers would be that of Viacons and Beast Machines. The Viacons exist to serve as a mass army threat, but whenever they're on screen, they really only exist to get their asses kicked, and really don't serve any other purposes. TV Tropes calls it conservation of ninjutsu, and it refers to the concept where one bad guy grunt poses a threat, but dozens of them are mere cannon fodder. And Transformers Prime is incredibly guilty of this. In fact, when the Viacons are no longer able to be taken seriously, factoring in all the times they get beaten up, blown up, and so on, the series introduces a new villain grunt type called the Insecticons for our heroes to fight. In their introductory episode, a single Insecticon is enough to bring Megatron nearly to his knees, but in subsequent appearances, they're capable of being swallowed swatted out of the sky like gnats. The scavenger hunts and the constant relics don't do any favors for the stakes of the series either. If some all-powerful item is introduced, it's often overshadowed by another in a following episode. Like I mentioned earlier, Season 2 introduces the Star Saber, a powerful blade with the ability to slice mountains in half, something which strikes fear into Megatron's very spark, but in the next episode he's able to break it to pieces with a new weapon. Relics like the Spark Extractor, something which is stated to do something as horrific as extract the very souls of anyone in the area, is used as a threat and then locked away in a vault until a battle where it's just used on some Viacons. Or what about the time where Megatron establishes a Decepticon fortress in the United States and it's destroyed and forgotten about in a few episodes' time? Honestly, I could go on and on about this type of stuff. It litters the series. Now, if you've ever seen Matt Stone and Trey Parker talk about storytelling, they'll warn you about the pitfall of the and then.
But we can take these beats, which are basically the beats of your outline, and if the words and then belong between those beats, you're f***ed, basically. You got something pretty boring. What should happen between every beat that you've written down is either the word therefore or but, right? So what I'm saying is that you come up with an idea and it's like, okay, this happens, right? And then this happens. No, it should be this happens and therefore this happens. But this happens, therefore this happens. And that, as soon as we are able to, and literally sometimes we'll write it out to make sure we're doing it. We'll have our beats and we'll say, okay, this happened, but then this happens, and that affects this, and that does to that, and that's why you get a show that feels like, okay, this to that, to this to that, but this, here's the complication, to that.
It's a really simple way to identify if the story actually has a narrative flow, or if it's just an onslaught of events happening. And if you're ever developing a story, I urge you to think of this method. Transformers Prime is a show that's full of the and then. The Autobots are on Earth, and then Megatron shows up. And then he tries to make a zombie army, and so on. It's why the majority of Transformers Prime begins to blur together, and it's also what makes moments like Starscream abandoning the Decepticons stand out more. It's a rare source of complication in the overall story, and thus becomes far more memorable. Compare this to something like Beast Wars. The cast crash lands on a planet, but the planet has 2 moons, so it's not the planet they think is Earth. Therefore, conflict erupts. But their battles attract the attention of powerful aliens, therefore revealing on one of the moons is fake, so the planet actually was Earth. I understand that's a bit of a generalization, but at the same time, would you even say there's a general structure to the first season of Prime? There's occasional recurring elements, but the finale of the season is built around the sudden realization that Unicron was Earth all along. And somehow, this detail is seemingly forgotten by the start of the next season. It's brushed off as resolved. Perhaps you could say the running theme of Season 1 was in regards to Dark Energon, but it doesn't really build up or go anywhere. And that goes for pretty much most things. From how Smokescreen very nearly becomes a Prime but was completely abandoned, to all the relic hunts despite only a select few having purpose to the overall scheme of the story. This is what it all comes down to. Honestly, what I'd say one of the biggest wastes of potential for the show was the fact that I think there's a lot of really good things here. The Binder of Revelation clearly had a lot of work put into it, yet the showrunners seemed like they wanted to do things their own way. And sometimes that's okay, but then you see how projects like the video game Fall of Cybertron were modified to better accommodate fitting in with Transformers Prime. Basically, other projects modified themselves to better fit Transformers Prime, but Transformers Prime ultimately didn't know what shape it wanted to be in the first place. The final nail in the coffin probably comes with Season 3 and the shift into Beast Hunters. According to Rick Alvarez, this was the breaking point. The show writers wanted to distance themselves from what they felt were the limitations set by the Binder of Revelation, and Hasbro wanted a more unified continuity. Season 3 became a battleground for these clashes of mindsets, and the walls began to close in on the series. The budget was ballooning out of control, and this, combined with the fact that the hub as a channel was severely underperforming, spelled troubled times ahead for Prime. Matters became worse when the new Hasbro design team entered the fray for the time of Season 3's production, looking to add beasts to the franchise, which ultimately led to a scenario where nobody was happy. The Beast characters that Hasbro wanted to sell toys of couldn't be added to the show, and the studio behind Prime was upset that they had to completely scrap their original plans for Season 3. Regrettably, these plans for the most part are relatively unknown, aside from the fact that pirates were intended to be introduced into the fray as another faction. Man, pirate concepts in Transformers have a real nasty habit of getting cancelled, huh? huh? It was all this bad blood, feuding, team changes, and problems with the hub that ultimately led to Prime's downfall. The hub was deemed a failure and converted back to a Discovery Channel, and a sequel series, Robots in Disguise, was put together to air on Cartoon Network, shoved into random time slots, and tossed aside to make way for more Teen Titans Go episodes. And The Binder of Revelation, the book that cost over $250,000 for Hasbro and was intended to serve as a groundwork for the franchise, well, according to Rick Alvarez, as mentioned, it now lives in the bottom of a drawer somewhere in Pawtucket. When you look at the series as a whole, and factor in that behind-the-scenes info, I can't help but consider Transformers Prime a tragedy of a series. It honestly has some serious groundwork set for it, but the clashing of visions really spelt doom for it overall. It's not the worst Transformers show, it's not even that bad compared to some real bad moments in the franchise, but what I think makes it stick out is that there's so much that could have worked with it. As I said, the music is phenomenal, and the designs are great, and the setup for some of the characters could have led to some really dynamic storytelling, but that's not what came of it. And in a way, I find that to be a bit more disappointing than a show that was just all around bad to begin with. If you're a fan of Transformers Prime, more power to you, and I'm not going to attack you for that. But I just think there's so much more to the franchise that may be even more enjoyable, and if you haven't already, I'd highly encourage you to check out other series like Transformers Animated or Beast Wars. And if you haven't seen Transformers Prime and are somewhat curious to see what I've described in action, well, you can actually find all the episodes here on YouTube from the official Transformers channel. As for the legacy of Transformers Prime, well, it lives on in some form. Prime character designs are used for individuals like Knockout or Bulkhead in the IDW comics, and recently in the toy world, characters from the Prime universe are featured in the Transformers Legacy toy line. So the series itself is remembered by Hasbro, even if it didn't quite pan out as they intended. And of course, it did bring in many fans to the series as a result of its initial popularity when it launched. It was a really big venture for the brand, something that hasn't really been replicated on the small screen quite in the same way. And I think maybe the franchise is due for something new, an attempt to revamp the brand in a similar fashion, setting the groundwork for a massive new project spanning beyond just one form of media. Sure, Transformers Prime had clashing visions, but I think what was needed is a strong vision from the start, to be carried out by people who all around agree with that particular vision for the whole brand. Transformers definitely isn't a dead franchise, and still has a lot of life in it, and I don't think one case of wasted potential should spoil the rest of it. It's clear that the failures of Transformers Prime spooked Hasbro away from more expensive ventures, leading to cheaper projects like the Machinima series, the Netflix series, and Cyberverse, which are honestly topics for another video. But I think the feud over Prime as a series shouldn't frighten them. Sometimes you need to invest a bit to start up a new series. Just look at the investment the first live-action film needed. And honestly, even though I'm not particularly fond of Prime, what I do appreciate is how the brand is capable of constantly reinventing itself to try out new things, and is capable of doing so again. Really able to transform itself, if you would. Okay, that was a bad one. But if you really want to know something bad, check out what Prime Megatron's favorite hobby is.
When I get vacation, I enjoy the dark side of Pluto. It's so peaceful it allows me to concentrate on my favorite hobby, watercolors.
Really, what terrible taste. We all know who the best pony is.
And then you got Rarity. Total knockout.
I like the way I look in steel-belted radials.
Well, that one was certainly a doozy. If you somehow made it to the end of the video, thank you so much for watching. This one took a ton of effort to put together. What are your thoughts on Transformers Prime? Did I manage to tick off anyone with these bad takes? Let me know in the comments below. This was definitely an experiment with a bit of a longer form video, and if you felt this format was enjoyable, let me know if I can do more. If I could stay active, that is. And as always, if you enjoyed the video, I ask that you consider liking it or subscribing to the channel to get more content like it. And if you have any suggestions for future videos, feel free to join our Discord, linked in the description below. Thank you so much for watching, and I hope I could see you next time.
And now it's time for Ask Megatron. Neil C. asks, which celebrity would you most like to vaporize?
I would most like to vaporize anyone on reality television. Except for Donald Trump. Out of professional courtesy, of course.
That one didn't age quite so well.